So I am speaking today with my friend Jason Green, who is a comic book writer and editor. And since I was lucky enough to redo this intro, I'm not going to botch it. So we're just going to go from there. But Jason, I know that are you one of the heads of the St. Louis comic book anthology Ink and Drink? Like you're one of the main editors of that?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit just of how you got into your role as editor and how you eventually got to the place of the Ink and Drink anthology comic series?
Sure thing. So I've always been of the editorial mindset. I was that kid that back in high school, I would be the one to touch the paper last because I want to make sure that I fix everybody else's grammatical errors, right? And in about 2004, I started writing for a website, it was a magazine at that point called Playback St. Louis. I was a big fan of music, big fan of comic books. They primarily at that time focused on covering, music, especially local music, live music, and movies. And so I started out writing music reviews for them. And then after I'd been there for about a year, I got in a conversation with one of the other guys in the group called Brian Hollerback about comic books on our email listserv. And somebody made the sly comments to our boss, Laura Hamlet. Hey, Laura, you should add a comic book section. And she said, sure. Hey, Jason, you're in charge of it. It's like, wait, what? So at that point, this is 2005, I started running the comic book coverage for the magazine. This was kind of like the Riverfront Times. It was about 60 pages every month. It was free, find it at every record store and restaurant in town. And so every month I had 2 pages that were my domain. One page would be an interview with, some kind of famous comic book person that had something coming out. And then the other page would be reviews of things that were coming. And I got to interview a lot of really, really cool people. I mean, the first one was Alex Robinson. If you're familiar with him, he did Box Office Poison.
I'm familiar with his work. I reviewed one of his books on my old podcast, Too Cool to Be Forgotten, I think.
Yeah.
Love that book.
So he had just put out what was kind of sort of a sequel to Box Office Poison called Tricked. I interviewed him about that. I got to interview Mike Mignola about Hellboy. Got to interview Jeff Loeb, Eric Larson. Robert Kirkman.
Total A-list names, in the comic book community.
Yeah, I mean, it was cool to be in print. People would actually pay attention to you. You weren't just like some guy with a website.
Some guy with a YouTube podcast.
Exactly. And so then time marched on, and then we were just guys with websites because the magazine folded. Having a print publication is just very expensive. And when we went web only, I'm like, well, I'm not going to update monthly. I'm going to update weekly. And so I ended up building up this whole group of people who wrote comic book reviews for me. And, I was the editor. I was in charge of, not only copy editing everything that was sent in, but also, figuring out stuff to review, pitching it to people who I thought would review it, getting the, promotional stuff from the publishers, all that sort of thing. And, through that, Brian Hollerback, who was a music contributor, started writing comic book reviews. A guy named Carlos Ruiz, who was doing some comic strips in Playback called Pretentious Record Store Guy, started doing comic book reviews for me. A guy named Steve Higgins, who was a professor at Lewis and Clark he's in the English department, but he teaches a comic books as lit class. He started doing reviews for me. And, all of these people that I built up in this little group of people writing about comics also made their own comics. I was one of those guys too, right around the same time when I started writing reviews of comics. I also was with a group of guys that I had met through the Eric Larson message board. And we were in a group called Low Key Comics, publishing our own stuff.
Yeah. That is the Low Key Comics Eric Larson message board is something that's come up on this podcast several times because although I was never a part of that, I've come to know several people that were. Chris McJunkin, obviously a mutual friend of ours. And a few episodes ago, I did an interview with Mark Welser and Rich Woodall. And Mark, I think has done some stuff with Loki.
Yes, he did. Yeah, he was one of the first guys hanging around there, and I met Mark through the Eric Larson message board. Yeah, I mean, you go back to 1998, and there's guys like Robert Kirkman used to post on there all the time. He came on there, hey, you want to read my wrestling comic Behind the Ropes, I think it was called. Yeah. This is even before Battle Pope, right?
So that's the secret to breaking into comics, is go back in time and be on Eric Larson's message board. Like,
yes,
that's apparently like the place to be.
Yeah, I mean, so Joe Keating, who's done a bunch of Image books, he's won a couple Eisners, or at least one Eisner. Oh man, who else? Anyway, yeah, it was Jim Demonakis, who runs Emerald City Comic Con. He was Eric Larson's webmaster.
Yeah.
So yeah, just all kinds of people. And so anyway, so I had been making my own comics for a few years. Carlos had, Steve had, Brian had always thought about it, and Carlos had the idea of doing these get-togethers that we called Ink and Drinks, where we would get together at a bar. I'd like to say it's somewhere cool. Unfortunately, it was Applebee's, because they they had cheap food and cheap beer, and so
cheap is cool.
Yeah,
it's punk rock, man.
So we would get together once a month. The guys who were working on comics would bring the stuff they were working on, and it blossomed from a group of 4 or 5 people to a group of 12 people. And Carlos had the idea, hey, we should do a comic together. And that was when the very first Project Comic Con out in Maryland Heights was going to happen.
Yeah.
And it was going to be in September. And so we're like, well, it's right before Halloween. Let's do a horror anthology. We'll just all come up with horror stories, put them all together, and we'll sell it at the con, and we'll sell it through Halloween, and it'll be pretty cool. And so as soon as we put the word out that we were doing this, all of a sudden our meetings went from 12 people to like 2 or 3 dozen people. Like, oh, hey, this is kind of crazy. And so we put together the book. I happen to have a copy handy here. And so this was our very first publication. It debuted at Project Comic Con in September of 2010. We sold out of our first print run, and we're like, holy cow. We weren't expecting that. And so then we had a release party at Star Clipper 2 weeks later, and we sold another 100 copies of it. It was like, oh man, this is sold better than anything we've done individually. And people are like, well, what's going to be in the next book? It's like, well, we weren't going to do a next book, but okay. And so what's it going to be? Well, this one was all horror stories. Let's do all crime stories. And so it just kind of went from there. And the original core group that did the planning, it was Carlos, and he brought in Brian because Brian is like a real editor. Like, that's his actual day job that he's done professionally for decades at this point. And then I kind of weaseled my way in there because I had published comics before, right? And it was like, well, it's good to have 3 people. Then we have a tiebreaker for decisions, and so it just became the 3 of us. And we kind of went from there. Just it's like, well, we did a second book. When are we going to do it? Let's do it in 6 months. See if we can do 2 a year. And then we did, over and over and over again.
That's an incredible deadline to hit. Like, I don't. 2 books a year is on an indie level. Like, when you're dealing with the independent creators that you're dealing with, like, that is incredible to be able to put that all together and get it out. Like, I know how difficult it can be to work with people at that level.
Sure. And it's funny, I went to Small Press Expo in Bethesda, Maryland, and got to sit in on a panel about comic book collectives, basically. And all of them were like, yeah, we've been together for 7 years, and we put out this one thing, and it was this big, beautiful, collection, right, of all kinds of stuff. It was very lovingly created. All of the stuff that people were talking about was really cool. Some of them would do a thing every 2-3 years, and then I was conveniently the last person in the line, so I could be like, yeah, so we do 80 to 100 pages anthologies twice a year, and like jaws hit the ground.
Everybody
right?
goes, what?
Yeah. So your inherent question is, how do we do that, right?
Yeah.
And the most important part is there's a deadline, and we're kind of flexible in the deadline in that, like, okay, well, we have to edit, we have to put all this stuff together. If you're like 90% done, go ahead and finish it. We'll wait for you. But all of our stuff is planned around a convention. So there's a point where we have to say, you're late, you're not in the book.
Yeah.
And the thing that goes with that is that because all the books are themed, it's not like you can just say, well, I'll put it in the next book.
Right. Yeah.
It's like, oh, I'm late for the crime book, I'll do the next one. Well, the next one's science fiction, and your story's not science fiction, so it's not for that either.
Yeah.
So either it's done or it's gone.
Yeah.
And so, that was a big motivator in getting people to get their stuff finished and get it in there.
That's an interesting angle that I actually hadn't considered, but now that you mention it, I would actually say it's probably the reason why I have never really submitted anything to the Ink and Drink anthology. I was like, full disclosure, like I've been in one Ink and Drink book. In your the first superhero book that you did, I think it was called Liquid Courage.
Liquid Courage, yes.
Yep. And I submitted a short story that I don't like to publicly admit this, but I wrote and drew it myself. And I had a lot of fun doing it, and I probably like to do more of it in the future. But yeah, like that was, I don't want to sound flippant, but like the quickness with which you guys turn these things around really made me feel like I would never be able to get something done in time, because I'm somebody who I'm a writer, and so I work with artists, and I usually try to pay the artists that I work with a page rate. So I'm like thinking about like allocating budgets, but I'm also thinking I'm like juggling all these other projects, and I'm like, oh, we're not going to have time to get to that, in time for you guys to get your book out. So that is like, I don't know. I never thought about it in that context, but I think that is a reason that it always kind of like put me off to try and like really like go head on into one of the anthology books. But I imagine that helps you guys a lot in terms of just like keeping people on task,
For sure. And it also, like, I mean, that first meeting that's like, the one that's immediately before the deadline, where we're like, 4 weeks out or whatever, is where you have a lot of people be like, what's the theme of the next one? Like, I've finally given up hope on getting something done here.
Yeah, they're thinking like, 7 months ahead.
I could totally get something.
Yeah, but yeah, I get that. That's interesting. So, as editor of the Ink and Drink, I mean, it has to be such a headache to try and corral all these creators. Like, I can barely do it with like the 1 or 2 that I work with on my regular projects. What is like how often do you guys have to reject a short story just for whatever reason? Either it's not done in time, or it just doesn't fit the theme as well as you thought it might. Like, does that happen a lot? Like, is that or is everybody pretty much on the ball when it comes to putting it together?
Yeah, it honestly doesn't happen a lot. When it happens, it's generally, I guess the big thing is we try and have a consistent level of quality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we try to think of it not in terms of, what we want to see, because, there's stuff that gets submitted that's like, it's not really my kind of comics. But as a critic, as somebody who's read some of everything, who's really studied the medium, right? Like, there's things that aren't for me, but like I appreciate them and I want them in the book because it's something for a different kind of reader than me, right?
Yeah.
So, the main thing is that it just has to fit the theme and be good comics. And so when people turn in stuff that was clearly not thought through with the theme, those get rejected. But the big one is weak storytelling.
Yeah.
If it doesn't make sense, either in words or in visuals, then it gets rejected. And that's the hard one. And that's one of the things where, we really try and lean on our experience to help to explain with these people, because we've had people who have been rejected who have taken advice to heart and improved and gotten in the next book, right?
Okay.
And that's the goal. I mean, we want to publish good comics, and we want to foster a cool scene in this town. So we want to just help people put out the best thing that they can. And one of the things that I always tell people when they first approach the group is, as editor, I'm here as much or as little as you need me to be. There are people who will send every single step of the way. They want you to read their 1 paragraph description, and then their script, and then their pencils, and then their inks, and then their letters, and then it's done, right? And then there's other people who they just deliver the whole package and it's finished. And obviously, if there's problems, man, you wish it was the first person. But
right.
but so there are people, especially we get people who are recommended to us from some of the group members that are college professors. We have quite a few, I think 4 that teach at Webster actually. And so when people who are in college who are thirsty for that knowledge will, they'll seek out the feedback, and then when they turn it in, like, oh yeah, there's no problem, because you sorted through any issues that there were going to be up front. So yeah, that's the main one, is if the storytelling's not clear, or the plot doesn't land or doesn't go anywhere. I mean, there's a certain kind of story that it's okay if it doesn't go anywhere. But like, if it's clearly just like, I don't know how to write a short story, then that's a problem. Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, we're very lucky in that, most of the people who need the help ask for it. And we can kind of shepherd it along and make sure that it's the best it can possibly be when submission time comes.
Yeah. I apologize in advance for this question, but have you guys kept on schedule during the pandemic in this last year?
Oh man, no.
Well, don't take it too bad. I don't think. I think the whole world
where to sell stuff, right?
Right, exactly. There's no conventions. There's no nothing.
Right. I mean, our primary modes of selling things are at conventions and at stores that can hand sell it. And so the hand selling is just starting to come back. Star Clipper, especially when they were in the Loop, they were great for us.
Yeah.
And the Washington Avenue location was really good too, because they would get tourists be like, hey, like, I want a comic book from St. Louis. Or like, right here.
Here's the local comic book scene.
Yeah. We're all in the I section of graphic novels. We were talking, the last thing we were talking about was where we sell it.
Yeah, just talk like comic books. That was my question. It was like with 2020, when 2020 happened, that just like threw everything off track. Everything was off the rails and no longer on schedule. So you were not able to keep the 2 book a year. I'm not trying to pour salt in your wounds. I'm just trying to, keep track of where things are going.
Yeah, no. So we had a book that was planned for spring of last year to be released at Wizard World St. Louis in April or whenever it was originally planned for. And when that didn't happen, we kind of drug our feet. I say it was mostly me. I think I was the last person I had a story to letter. And I kept putting off lettering it for a little while because we don't have anywhere to sell it. So we did finish and publish a book last year. It's called Mixer. It's a romance anthology. And so it's only been sold online. You could buy it because of the distributor we use. You can buy it through like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any book publisher. But that's the only way that we've sold it so far. And so when fall came around, I mean, we had a book announced. There was another superhero book. We had a deadline, and we had a number of people who didn't finish, and we just kind of let it drag. And so now we're at the point where it's time to finalize it, and it's basically ready to put together. We don't have a convention to sell it at because Wizard World St. Louis this year has already been pushed to next year. Because it would have been in April or May like it usually is.
Right.
And so yeah, it's something that we'll work on finishing up. And then I guess the other thing to point out, to brag about how much we can do is not only do we do the 2 books every year that are full graphic novel size, right?
Trade paperbacks,
the binding and everything. But we also do a mini comic for Free Comic Book Day.
Yeah.
And we had one planned for last year that people had just started getting into like the planning of their stories when everything shut down and Free Comic Book Day got canceled. Well, Free Comic Book Day is in August this year.
Right.
So we are going to go ahead and do that. So we'll get the superhero anthology finished and released, and we'll get our Free Comic Book Day book finished and released. One of the other things that we're working on, and I'm going to note, let me double check with Carlos and Steve before we leave this in for
Mhm.
the discussion. But one of the things that we've been talking about doing, because Ink and Drink turned 10 years old, is doing a collection of the greatest hits of Ink and Drink, where we kind of get input from all of the different creators of what their favorite stories have been
Oh
over the
yeah.
10 years. And we do one big volume of like the best of the best, right?
Yeah.
And we want to make sure that we do that right, that we are really representative of all of the people. And I mean, you can't have literally everybody because there's been 125 different creators involved. But as big a breadth of what Ink and Drink means and the best of what we are capable of doing all in one book. I'll probably do a big Kickstarter for that and really try and, get a lot of attention to it outside of our normal,
Yeah.
convention and comic shop sales channels.
That's actually a pretty awesome idea. I think that's pretty cool. But that leads me to a follow-up question. It's and I'm sure you don't know the actual number, but like, how many creators do you think you guys have published in all of your books? I guess first question, preface that. How many books, like literally how many books have you guys put out, if you know?
I believe it's 21.
Wow, 21.
Yeah.
Because I was shocked when you said like 10-year anniversary. I was like, oh my God, has it been 10 years? But then I thought, yes, it has been 10 years. Because I remember when I first like dipped my toe into making comic books, and I went to my local comic book store and was like, hey, I've decided I'm going to start publishing comics. And they're like, have you heard about this group Ink and Drink? And they showed me one of their books. The guy that owned the comic book store was like, hey, you might be interested in hooking up with these guys. And I think that was when I first heard about you. And your first Ink and Drink book had just come out, and he had some copies in his store. And so that's probably, because I'm actually having trouble thinking of like when we would have first come into contact. It probably would have been digitally, like either I emailed you or messaged you on Facebook or something, or met at a convention.
That we met at Wizard World.
That was probably it. Yeah, because I would have done Wizard World that year, so you would have been there, and I would have been like, "That's the guy that my comic book store guy told me to go meet." So,
I want to say that it was the first Wizard World, which was the one where rather than having it in the dome, they had it in the big concrete area.
Yeah,
and they had it was like big, long, and skinny. Mm-hmm. And they had the signature people all the way at the end, and we were right by Henry Winkler.
Yeah,
and so we got his people waiting in line to meet him.
We're all looking at your booth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Henry Winkler actually stopped by and gave us a hey, good work, guys.
Oh, nice.
Hey, the Fonz.
Yeah.
Right. So that would have been that was the convention where Tanked came out, which was our war anthology, and if I'm doing the math in my head right, was our 6th book.
6th book. Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. So anyway, back to the initial question I asked before I sidetracked with several other questions.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, you guys you've published a lot of creators then in your anthology. Like, are they mostly all from St. Louis?
The vast majority of them are. I want to say there's probably only a handful of stories where nobody involved in it is from St. Louis.
Okay.
But we have used a lot of people outside of there was one guy who painted most of our covers. His name's Adam Davenport. He's not in St. Louis. He went to Mizzou with Carlos, which is how we knew him. And it's like, hey, a painter, let's have painted covers. These will really grab attention, right? But he was living in, I believe, Louisiana when he started working with us. He's in Houston now. Mm-hmm. He's a fine artist. He does sculpture and painting and gallery showings, and we were so lucky to have him.
Yeah.
This lovely zombie Miles Davis cover that was by Kyle Morton, who is another Eric Larson message board guy. He actually came up with the name Low Key Comics. He did a really cool graphic novel called Husk, the Hollow Planet, that was written by Scott Thompson from Kids in the Hall.
Oh yeah.
So he's from Omaha, Nebraska.
I think that book has actually come up on this podcast before. I
haven't
awesome. Read it, but I've specifically looked into the book because of the Kids in the Hall connection.
Yeah, it's worth reading. It's actually a lot of fun. It's a really interesting blend of comedy and high fantasy. So I definitely check it out. But yeah, so those are the kind of couple outliers. But for the most part, everybody is from St. Louis. Because a lot of the connections that are made come from coming to our monthly meetings. And a lot of the stories that show up would never happen if it wasn't for people gathering together in person and just starting to talk about what kind of comics they want to make. So that kind of only happen if you're local. But having that local connection has really helped us sell the stuff too. I mean, like even when we're out of town, like when we were in Kansas City at Planet Comic Con, and like, hey, we're a group from St. Louis. They'd be like, oh, you're local. It's like, well, 4 hours away. But
like,
yeah,
sure, sort of. As local as Chicago is to St. Louis, like.
Yeah, Chicago cared a lot less about us being from St. Louis.
I'm not surprised by that. Chicago, they're a little hoity-toity.
Yeah,
they're pretty proud of themselves. Yeah. I'm sorry.
There's a story I love to tell about how meeting in person really makes our concept work, right? So we keep our themes really generic for these anthologies: horror, crime, science fiction, Western, kind of just the very classic, like pre-Marvel comic genres, right? And we had a fantasy anthology coming out. It was our 5th book. It's called Hammered. You can sense the puns involved in all of our book titles. And Steve Higgins, who I mentioned before, who he started as just one of our writers. And then when Brian Hollerback had to step away because he moved away to Cape Girardeau, Steve stepped in to be editor because he's an English teacher. Who better to tell you where the commas go, right?
Yeah.
And so this was, it's like Steve is co-editor now, and he wants to make sure he's in this fantasy book that we're putting out, but he has no ideas. And we're like, 6 weeks out from the deadline, and we're hanging out at Cicero's, which was our old meeting location.
Yeah.
And he was talking with this artist, Jim Mosley, who used to work at Star Clipper. And he's like, Jim, we should do something together. I can make it really short. So like, what kind of fantasy stuff do you like? And I'll write a story around what you're looking for, because I have no ideas. And Jim thinks about it for a second. He's like, I always wanted to do a story about that cool fantasy art you see airbrushed on the side of 70s vans. And he's like, I'll come up with something.
Yeah.
And so he came up with what was actually my favorite story in that book, which was this nerdy kid walks by this van, and it's got a wizard painted on the side of it. And the wizard's like, if you let me cast a spell on you, you will be all powerful. Women will fall at your feet. And he's like, yes, I'll do it. And, spoiler alert, they switch places. And now the boy is painted on the side of the van as like Conan with these women like wrapped around his legs, but he's trapped there forever. And the wizard's like, hell, you idiot. And then walks away. This great little 4-page story. And that never would have happened if those two guys didn't have that conversation, right? It's like just getting the balls spinning in your head and coming up with that story, and then Jim drawing it just perfectly. It was just kismet how that all fell together.
That's great to hear, because I do think that's one of the great things about comic books as a medium is just the collaborative nature of like a writer and an artist, and how they're like comic books as a visual medium, but they're both in many ways equal creators, because writers have things they want to do, artists have things they want to do, and they both kind of bring something unique to create the specific thing called a comic book. And that's awesome to hear that manifests itself in these ink and drink meetings.
Yeah, that's that's one of the things that whenever I talk to somebody at conventions, they always every convention we go to is at least a dozen people who are like, how do I get involved in this? Like, come to a meeting. And of the dozen people that ask that question, maybe 1 or 2 show up, but those are the people who are like really interested in what we're doing and tend to be the ones that stick around. So
yeah, that is cool. So I want to talk a little bit about your. I do still want to talk about you as an editor because, like, again, full disclosure for a second time, Jason, you've worked as an editor for me on my short story work that I do with Robot Pulp, and that has been incredibly valuable because I kind of got into creating first through comic books because I was somebody who had a lot of was very self-conscious about the stuff that I did. So I was like, if I work on comics, I'm working with somebody else, and, an artist, and they'll help bring it to light. So it's not all on me. But a few years ago, I decided to kind of like dip my toe into writing some prose, and it was actually 2020 before the pandemic hit, but it turned out to be throughout the whole pandemic that I started doing these short stories, these Robot Pulp short stories, based off my friend Ed Bickford's Robot Pulp series, where he would draw science fiction covers and then I would write stories based off them. And I was like, I went into that and I was like, okay, I really need an editor. Like, I need somebody to just be able to objectively look at the story and help not just like bring it to life, but just like fix all the little things that I miss. Because there's an interesting thing that happens, I think, like with creative minds, where they're just constantly like moving, and they're always like, write it down and then move on. And it's really hard to get into like an analytical space where you're just like, okay, comma here, period here, this is a run-on sentence, et cetera, et cetera. So you've been very helpful with that aspect. But so I only say all of that just to, give you proper credit for, the work that you've done with me. But
yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, as a creator yourself, as somebody who likes to write, you've written and self-published comics yourself, not just in the Ink and Drink, but you've had your own series. Is that something that that you think about a lot, like editing, or is that just something that's just like really natural to you? Like, you just have always just had that like laser focus on things?
Yeah, I think honestly a lot of it comes from being a critic primarily, and the hundreds of comics that I reviewed over that. I've been reviewing comics, like I said, since 2005, and there was a stretch in 2006, 2007 when playback first went digital only, where I was doing reviews just about every week. It was kind of like I made the mental note of, I want to have 2 reviews every Friday. And so Thursday night, if nobody had sent anything in, well, I guess I'm doing 2 reviews tonight and I'll be up until 3 a.m, right?
Yeah.
But so I read so many things, that analytical, what works and what doesn't and why mindset, that it really helps when I'm doing the type of editing that I'm doing on Robot Pulp, where it's like, you don't want me to tear it apart, but you want me to tell you what doesn't work, right? You want me to, in addition to, being the spelling and grammar and comma police, but like, did I miss anything? And that's something that I think I'm really well suited for because of being a critic. I think of, so one of the other primary things, and I don't know if you had questions about this, we can definitely return to it later if you do, but I've been working with Jim Ousley, not to be confused with Jim Mosley, the artist I was just talking about. Jim Ousley is a local screenwriter and comic book writer.
Yeah.
And so I've done 3 graphic novels with him, and we're just starting to work on the 4th. And he sent me his outline for the 4th one, and one of the things was like, hey, this character shows up in issue 1 and 2, but not 3 and then 4. Like, your readers are going to forget who this is if they don't show up in issue 3. He's like, oh yeah, that's a good point. It's like, hey, the first time this person shows up, you need to mention them by name, because that's how readers will learn their name. Otherwise, they think it's just some like anonymous henchman, and then all of a sudden they have a name later. Like these type of things, like when you've read enough comics that screw up those nuts and bolts things, they jump out at you when they're missing. And that's something that a real professional editor, not just a copy editor, can really help with, fine tuning it to where it reads as professionally as anything that Marvel and DC put out, because, they've got writers who, A, don't forget to do that stuff, but B, if they do, the editor catches it and you never see it.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's one of the things I try and do, is just trying to make sure that it reads right, it reads clear. I try and put my mindset of what is the writer trying to say, and am I understanding it, or is there something missing in certain places?
Mm-hmm.
I think those are the easiest way to make something a stronger piece without necessarily injecting my personality into it, because it's not my story, right?
Right.
And try and resist, Monday morning quarterbacking specific plot points, because you're not going to rewrite it just because I'm like, oh well, I don't like that character, so why does he get to be cool in this scene or whatever? Right?
Yeah.
So
that's a tough thing that I've had, because I've like sort of taken on like a quasi editor role in a few other projects with friends, and it can be very difficult when you have friends that are like, what do you think about my story, and they send it to you, and you're really trying to like separate, like, well, my preferences are this, but thinking about it on a technical level, how does it work? And I struggle with that, to separate that, because like, I'm like a lot of creators, I'm a little bit of an egomaniac. I like what I do, and I don't like what anybody else does. So, but yeah, I think you do that very well.
Thank you.
So do you find, like, as as a creative person yourself, like we haven't talked a whole lot about the comics that you've written and self-published, but like, do you enjoy the editing process? Is that easier for you than the creative process of writing a script yourself?
It flexes different muscles. I find it easier to go into that mode just because I'm in it constantly.
Mm-hmm.
Because, so I wrote for playback until 20. We alluded to this a little bit in the intro, right? But I wrote for playback until 2017 when it shut down, and then was sad I didn't have anywhere to post my reviews anymore. So I started my own website. It's called VArtsSTL, which you can find at vartsstl.com. And so now I'm editor-in-chief of the whole site. I have a film editor. Her name's Sarah Boslaw, and she's great at corralling together all the movie reviews. But I handle everything else. And because I'm totalitarian, I also go back in and double check the spelling and grammar in the movie reviews too. But so I'm editing stuff all the time. Mm-hmm. So especially going into copy edit mode is super easy for me. I can practically do that in my sleep. The more creative developmental editing, I should say, kind of stuff, is like writing, but it's kind of like flexing the muscle in a different way. I do enjoy it. I think, one of the ways that I work best as a writer, honestly, is kind of the same as editing, in that, like, working with an artist and kind of doing what I talked about Steve and Jim doing, of what do you want to draw? Like, and then writing around that. I like the idea of the themed anthologies and writing around the themes for them. When I've been involved, some of the neatest comics that I've done have been something where there's a puzzle to solve, which is, kind of like, fixing a story, puzzle solving. There was this short-lived comic company called Young American Comics that I met at Heroes Con, and they were putting out an anthology called Crash Boom Bang, where they had a list of sound effects, and you had to make a story that used just those sound effects and no dialogue, in order. And so it's like,
pretty good.
I like that.
I like that as a writing exercise, or just a creative exercise. Yeah,
exactly. And so I was at Heroes Con with my buddy Justin Krause, who lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, where Heroes Con is. And it's like, we need to do something for this. He's like, yeah, their books look really cool, like, I want to be in it too. And then when we were leaving Charlotte he had his buddy drive me to the airport, him and me and his buddy in this car, and it broke down and I missed my flight.
Oh no.
And I was so mad. And then I get back to his house. I had to wait till the next day to get the next flight out. And I look at that list of sound effects and I'm like, this is the sound of a car breaking down. And so that's the story I did.
Yeah.
Is the story of me missing my flight because this guy's car died. And it was great. It's 2 pages, and it may be the best 2 pages of comics I've ever done. But it was just like solving this weird little puzzle. And it's not something that, like, you think of writers as being like, well, I start with a completely blank page and stories just fall out of my head.
Yeah.
That's not what that was at all. But it's still like, as a reader, you don't need to know the story behind it so much as like the end result is something cool. And, I've been lucky in that a lot of the stuff I've done has been that way, whereas happy accidents, happy conversations turn into a really cool collaboration with somebody.
Yeah, I think that's definitely like a more common than some people might like to admit thing with like the creative process. Is like you never know when inspiration is going to strike, and like all kinds of stories just come from any little tiny event or big event that just happens randomly in your life, and it's something that sticks with you, and you just know you can make a story out of it. That's always just like neat to hear.
Yeah, I was very happy with how that one turned out.
Yeah, that's cool, man. Yeah, I'm just checking the time here. We still got a little bit, so no worries. You didn't have like a hard out or anything?
No.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
As long as we aren't still going at 5:30 tomorrow morning or something.
Well, hopefully not. So as somebody who writes and edits comics and somebody who's I if I remember this correctly, what you were saying, you kind of like did you start doing comic book reviews before you had started self-publishing and writing your own stuff? Which one came first?
They started at literally the exact same time.
Literally exact same time.
My first real comic came out in May of 2005. Okay. And I was already writing for Playback, but not comic stuff. And then the comic stuff started in September of 2005. So they were right in line.
So you were definitely the right man for this job. You were in there.
2005 was a good year, man.
It was like, that was probably one of the, I mean, that was like, cause I was like in the heart of it, like in comic book collecting. Like that was like my big year. I'd started getting back into collecting a few years prior to that. And then like 2005, I was like all in, where I was like, man, comic books are the future. I love comic books. And that's where I was probably the most inspired to eventually, I'm a slow mover, it takes me a long time to do anything. So it was a few years after that before I started doing my own thing. But 2005 was when the seed was planted, right around there, with everything that was just going on. Like that was where the big, like the writers revolution of like Marvel and DC, they were those companies were like turning themselves around in the late 90s, early 2000s after Marvel going bankrupt and, so forth. And by that time, the companies were just like back on track. And it was like a total Eden of unique comic book material,
Yeah, I mean, that's when, they really started pushing, your Brian Michael Bendis and your Warren Ellis and your Grant Morrison and, a lot of those guys who had been doing indie stuff that started doing mainstream stuff and really, selling great guns. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, thinking back to, when I first started writing comics. So I started doing that actually with my buddy Joe Costello, who was the same guy that I did that zine with when I worked at, that I did a zine with when I worked at Fantasy Books in Belleville back in college. And, Joe's an artist. He's a professional, graphic designer, to this day, really talented artist. And he always wanted to do comics. And, he is we talk about puzzle solving like I was before. He's a big, grand scale idea guy. And he always wanted me to be like the guy who did the execution part, because he would always like throw stuff at me. And, while we were working at the comic book store, and I'd be like, well, it's like, you gave me A and B, here's how you get there, right?
Yeah. The execution is the hardest part.
It is.
Everybody's an idea guy. This happens, and then you do this scene, but how do you link it together?
Yes, execution. That is good foreshadowing for what the story I'm about to tell. So, there was something in the air in like 2004 where me and several of the other, Eric Larson message board guys, we started talking about creating this Loki Comics thing. And they were all working on their stuff. And Joe and I were talking about the story that he had called Trio, that was about a guy who starts finding these mysterious notes. And when he reads the note, it has like instructions on it. He follows the instructions, and he ends up saving somebody's life almost on accident.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of the mystery of, well, where are they coming from and what meaning does it have in his life, right? And we started working on this story, and it kind of, he had all of these grand plans for all of this other stuff that was like magnum opus 300 issue stuff. It's like, well, let's do something small and self-contained. He came up with Trio. He and I fleshed it out together. It was going to be a 4-issue miniseries. It was going to be awesome. And as the Loki comic stuff started to come together, it's like, hey, well, Joe, I've got these buddies over here. Let's go ahead and do our first thing for them. We'll do just a little self-contained story in our universe that tells kind of what the gist of it is. And it'll be out here in this comic, Loki Comics #1 that we're putting out. And so we finished that. And that 7-page story that's in there is the only Trio that ever got finished. He and I have, gone back and forth on it. I've rewritten the series outline like 3 times, maybe 4 times, but we never got it off the ground. And that became a thing for me, over those years between when Loki #1 came out and when Ink and Drink started, where I'd have these ideas and I'd start working with artists on them, and they wouldn't be huge things. They'd be 3-issue, 4-issue miniseries, whatever. And for whatever reason, it just wouldn't happen. But I'd get a couple short comics, like 2-page comics about a missed flight completed. Yeah. And so then when Ink and Drink started up, and it's like, oh, I've got this venue where I can do short stories, which is literally all I've ever gotten published. I can put out 2 of those a year, 3 of those a year when we started doing the free comic book ones. And so that's been the vast majority of my writing has been short stories on accident, but like I've grown to really like the medium,
Yeah.
And I've still had, I've had other big projects that have fallen apart, sometimes because of the artist, sometimes because of me.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the only like big project, the only like full issue that was all original and all written by me, I started doing this story called Sprawl, which is set in like a post-apocalyptic near future St. Louis, where things basically have gotten so bad here that they just walled off the whole city. And so all of the neighborhoods turned into kind of their own little fiefdoms.
Yeah.
And one of the other neighborhoods attacks this grocery store, and this old guy comes over and stops all the guys from destroying the grocery store, and then just decides he's going to get revenge on the guys who planned the attack. And he just marches across St. Louis, post-apocalyptic near future St. Louis, punching people in the head, and their head explodes.
Nice.
It's very like Escape from New York, Fist of the North Star.
I was going to say Escape from New York was the first thing that came to my mind. Because that was filmed in East St. Louis.
Right. And that's exactly where the conversation that birthed that came from.
Yeah,
talking about, it's like, oh yeah, there's a scene from that filmed at the Fox,
right.
How cool is that? And, we ended up doing 1 issue of it. And that was with an artist called Aaron James Ford, who's a super talented guy, and he draws just like the most amazing hyperviolence. And he drew that whole issue for me. He did a great job, and he's like, I don't want to draw things with plots anymore. I just want to draw violence. I'm like, oh, I understand. I took you outside of your wheelhouse. For that, I apologize. And so I kind of let it lay fallow for a while, and then was like, oh man, I really want to finish this. And he's like, you know, you have my permission, go ahead and find another artist. And I came up with like, oh, I'm going to do revolving artists, a different artist every issue, but I haven't gotten off my butt and written it. And now it's been years since that first issue came out. And like I go to South Small Press Expo, and like people who there, like they pick up the one issue, like, oh man, this is awesome. When's number 2 come out? Like, you know, in 2017, I said, oh, next spring, but you know, it hasn't happened yet. So you know, I mean, that's the execution is everything. And, you know, if you don't, you know, that's one of the great things about the short story medium, is that you can execute in a reasonable amount of time where everybody's motivation stays intact, and you actually get it done.
That is also the curse of comics. I feel like comic books as a medium are very seductive, but also misleading. Because there's this sense of like, it's really easy to get into comics. Like all you got to do is draw a page. It's not like you're having to go out and film something, or, you know what I mean? Like it's simple. You just draw the art. But then it's like, it's very easy to get totally overwhelmed and buried under this like epic story that can grow out of that. And that's why the number one piece of advice that I always saw from people when you want to break into comics is do a short story. Don't start with your 12 issue or 50 issue epic. You know what I mean? Like, just
you'll never finish it.
Because you'll never finish it. Like, you just won't. Maybe 5 people in the last 10 years have finished their 50 issue epic that they started. One of them is named Jeff Smith. I don't know who the other 4 are, but there's not that many, you know.
Terry Moore is the king of actually landing that.
Yeah, that's why I say 5, because there's really not actually that many. And so that's the number one piece of advice, is always like start small. And you know, I'm somebody who just ignored that advice, and I think a lot of people do too, because it's easy to get sucked up into the creative feeling of like, oh, this can build and build and build and keep going. But yeah, like, so I empathize with what you're saying of just like short stories are great, but it's seductive to just want to keep building and going more and more.
Oh, sure. I mean, like, you know, one of the nice things about having these sob stories in my back pocket is because we have, you know, new people who are excited about the idea of creating comic books roll up in Ink and Drink meetings. It's like, oh man, I got this idea for this 300-page book. Right. And it's like, so I'm going to give you some advice. You should, and I'm not just saying this because I'm an Ink and Drink, you should make a story for an Ink and Drink book.
Yeah.
And your first time out, your limit is 4 pages. And that doesn't seem like a lot until you try and make it. And once you've done 4 pages, then we'll let you go to 8. And when you start, you'll understand why.
Yeah.
And they either never do it or they do it and they thank us.
Yeah. So that probably ties into my next question. But just like, what is the most common piece of advice you give to new creators as an editor? Obviously, think small is you know, the piece of advice. But like, what's the most common thing that you have to like keep going back to creators about?
Yeah, think small and just get it done is a big one. Concentrate on clear storytelling is another one. You know, it's like people who bring in their portfolios and it's just pinups. It's like, okay, like, how do you tell a story with pictures, right? That's the most important part of making comics. How do you tell a story with pictures? You know, making sure that your story has an ending, because you know, was talking before about stuff getting rejected, and you know, if your short story doesn't have an ending, it just stops. It's not a story. It's you know, a piece of a story.
Yeah.
And especially when you're in an anthology that's a self-contained anthology, do not hand me a story that ends with to be continued, because it's not going to be continued in my book.
Right.
You wrote a science fiction story. We're not going to do another science fiction anthology for 6 years. So no.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I get that. And that's frustrating too, because I like, speaking as a creator, I do think that the hardest thing for me is to think small, you know, and it's probably the best advice you could give to somebody, but it's really hard. Like, yeah, like it's just always thinking of like big stories and big stories. But I think there's a lot of value in honing that skill of just getting that little window into a short story. And that's obviously the type of thing that works in an anthology, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the only way that anthologies work. Like
Yeah.
everything has to be self-contained, unless you're doing an ongoing, and like Dark Horse Presents kind of stuff. And even then, I mean, those have a hard time selling, and they have to sell on a monthly basis, right? Ours is a
Right.
thing that like we roll into a convention, we have 20 books, and we want to convince the random person that walks up to the desk to buy one of them.
Yeah.
Right. So whatever catches their eye, and we give them the pitch of what's in it and why they should check it out. But you've got no guarantee of an audience checking out any of the other books,
right,
or necessarily checking out any of your other stuff. Although, I mean, we try and promote the other books and the people who are in them's other work as much as possible. But like your only contract with that person is they've bought this one book, they get your 8 pages. If they like it a whole lot, they may check out something else, but like that's it. So it's got to be self-contained,
yeah,
and entertaining on its own.
Yeah, we haven't even talked about just the general difficulty of selling an anthology in the American comic book market. Like,
it's terrible.
Like that's such a like an automatic death sentence when you're like, I got a new anthology coming out, and everybody's like, okay, well, see you never. Like,
yeah. And yeah, it's really hard. One of the big things I learned, because we did low key first, me and those groups of friends, and it was each thing that came out was whatever people had done at that time, right? Smattering of stuff. They're good comics. I go back and read them, and I'm still proud of what we did.
Yeah.
But like, what's the audience for it, right? And so, we really hit something by doing these genre themes, because we have people who will walk up to the table at Wizard World. They're there to meet, the cast of Justified or whatever.
Right.
And they like Westerns. There isn't a damn person selling anything Western in there, but here we have Western comics by people from your town. Oh, yeah. Cool. I'll check that out.
Yeah.
So the hyper local, we're from St. Louis thing, and then the genre theme of, people walk up, they're like, well, which one would I like? Well, what kind of movies do you like? Oh, I like Marvel superhero movies, so here's our superhero book.
Right. Right.
Oh, I like romance movies. Will you believe we did a romance anthology? Because we did. And so that makes it so much easier than any other, just like a random collection of stuff from people, right? It's really hard to sell that. So having that hook of like, there is an audience for this, and it's people who like this stuff, right? And some people will just be like, some people, that audience is local comics, and so like, well, here's a whole lot of local comics to sample and find people that you like and buy their other comics. That's a hook too, right? That's a hook that goes across all of the books. But the genre also helps sell any individual book. And so that, that's made us far more successful than anything that I've done solo. Because when you've done a thing, when you've written Amoral Stingray, like this is a thing that, has a specific audience. And so all day you've got people coming up who say, what's this? And then you tell them, they're like, that's not my thing. And they walk away.
Right.
It's like, I have your thing. If you talk to me long enough, I can convince you to buy one of these. Right?
I'll find you your thing. Yeah. Whatever your thing is, it's in here somewhere. We'll find it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even Marvel can't tell you that.
That is true. Yeah. But I agree. I do think that's a big, I don't want to say your biggest selling point, but it's certainly a big help in the whole Ink and Drink umbrella of just the theme genres. I like that. Makes it easy to sell to a wide amount of people, because like, you got so many books. You've been doing this for so long, like you said, 10 years, and you've been putting out 2 books a year. My goodness, so many books. And how many people do you meet at a convention that are ready to buy 20 books, much less 2 books? So it's like, sure, you're going to find somebody who is willing to buy 1 book, Like at least most people are willing to buy one book, and you've got enough covered, you know.
Yeah, it's more, being able to make sure that as few people as possible walk away empty-handed.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
That's the business sense.
Yeah, but it's funny. I mean, you look at different audiences. Wizard World we do pretty good at, but we did Small Press Expo in Bethesda, Maryland a few times.
Oh yeah,
and the audience is queued in for indie comics, but they don't want genre comics, right?
right.
They don't want crime books. They're not there for that. They're there for, like, the guy who stapled 100 zines on his living room floor last night.
Yeah,
that is him bearing his soul, right?
They're looking for the creator, the auteur.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I forget if it was the first year we did SPX. I want to say it was the second year. We had put out no, I'm sorry, it was the first year. We put out Sober, which was our nonfiction anthology, which has a lot of autobiographical
Mhm,
stuff in it, and it had a lot of nice lefty politics stuff in it. And it did okay there, but that audience is harder to sell to than Wizard World, where, like, the people there are at least fans of genre fiction, right? Because they're there to meet genre TV stars and genre movie
They're
stars,
actors,
right?
of genre fiction. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that makes it easier. But having the hook doesn't always help, because we did Archon in Collinsville, which is a sci-fi fantasy convention, and sold 3 books all weekend.
Oh, wow.
We had our sci-fi book and our fantasy book, and nobody cared. They're there to meet specific novelists, and they're there for the costume contest, and that's it. Like, they don't want to buy anything they've never heard of.
They're there for the party, Yeah.
Right. So you never know. But yeah, we try and make the stuff as appealing to as wide a range of people as possible, while still being true to what people in the group are interested in telling as stories.
Yeah. Well, dude, we've been going for a little over an hour now, so I think we're probably going to wrap it up. I do have a little story I wanted to tell. I couldn't decide if I wanted to tell it at the beginning or the end, so I think I'm going to save it for the end. This is the end of the podcast. I wanted to say, I did my Kickstarter for my book, The Immoral Stingray, last year, and I had a hard time because I'm not, like, connected with any networks or like, I barely exist online. You know what I mean? I just, like, make my books, and I barely exist in the real world too, honestly. But,
after the last year, I feel you, man.
Yeah, right. Oh man, how much of a, and we don't even have to go there. But anyway, so I had this thing where I was like, I'm gonna do this Kickstarter, and I need to, like, get my book out there. And I contacted you, and I was like, hey, I've got a YouTube channel. I'm not doing anything with it, but I need to put a video up. I need somebody to ask me about my book so I can pretend like I'm talking about it. And I had you do that. And, it was very gracious of you to do that. So it's very appropriate that, that was a little less than a year ago that I had you do that for me. And it's in this episode where I'm interviewing you that I'm going to announce that we are doing a new book. Yay! That was one of the questions you asked me at the end of the interview. You were like, so what's next for Stingray? And I really faltered, and I was like, oh, I don't know. Like, it's, if the book does well, maybe we'll do more, but I don't know. So I'm happy to finally say, in, like, 9 months later, we got another book coming out, Amoral Stingray number 5. So to answer your question from last October or whatever.
Thank you for following up with me, Aaron. I appreciate
it. Yeah. But it's funny too, just another little, like, bit of insider baseball. And I don't know if this will necessarily make it into the podcast. I think I mentioned this. Well, no, obviously you know about it. But it's strange after a year of being in a pandemic where you're just, like, quarantined and you're not talking to anybody. And then I set up that Kickstarter, and I was like, okay, I'll do this interview with my friend Jason. He'll just ask me some questions about the book, and we'll put it out there. And we did it, and I was really, really unhappy with it, because you asked me like the most softball questions. Like you were just like coming at it like, describe the character of the book, and I was like, I guess he's like a thing. I don't know. He's like a villain, and it was awful. It was a total train wreck. Not because of you, because of me.
It was better than you think. It was way better than you think.
I appreciate you saying that. But so I like went back and edited new answers into the video. This is like full confession mode, like I had like full editorial control, and you were very nice to not expose me on social media. But yeah, like I went back and I was like, I after watching the interview, I was like, that's awful. So I had to re-record answers to your questions that made it seem a little nicer. And it was after
I noticed that. I wasn't going to say anything.
Yeah, it was after doing that where I was like, man, it's been like a whole year where I haven't spoken to anybody, and I thought I could just wing this interview, and it was just a total bomb. Like, it was just awful. And so that was part of the reason why I decided I needed to jumpstart on this podcast thing and talk to people and just kind of like keep keep maintaining my skills, but also keep my creative batteries charged in a way of just like being in conversation and talking creatively to people. So it was after that train wreck of an interview that you did with me where I was like, okay, I can't let this happen again. I need to, in my defense, we had been in quarantine for a year. I hadn't done any conventions. Like, I hadn't spoken to anybody except my wife and my 3 coworkers, and they don't ask me about comic books because they don't care. But so all of that is to say, it was an eye-opening experience. I really appreciate you doing that for me. But in a weird way, you were an inspiration for this thing. Here we are almost a year later, and now I'm happy to interview you and talk about a lot of the work that you're doing.
Oh, well, thanks, man. I mean, I appreciate the opportunity. I don't get to talk about myself very often.
And that was kind of my thought, because like I was like, I want to talk about my book and I don't know where to do that. So I was like, let me see if I can create a platform for people that don't have opportunities to talk anywhere else about their stuff, and we'll just talk about your stuff. So in that spirit, where can people find your work and the Ink and Drink stuff, but also the comics that you've published? Or where would you like to send people to?
Best place to go, inkanddrinkcomics.com has all of the anthologies on there to order. You can also conveniently buy them. So we use Ingram, who's the world's largest bookstore distributor. And so they print all of our books. And so all of the books we've released through them, which is the last like 10 or so, are available to order from any bookstore, any library, any comic book store in the world that uses Ingram, which is just about all of them. Well, not in the world, I'm sorry, in America and the UK. And if you order them through Amazon, they even qualify for free Prime shipping, so you can't beat that.
Oh, right on. Yeah.
And locally, you can pick up our stuff at Apotheosis Comics, at Wizards Wagon, and at the new Star Clipper in Illinois. Right on.
Well, Jason, thank you again for doing this. I'm sure we will talk again at some point. I guess quick follow-up question. This doesn't have to be in the podcast, but what are your specific plans for the next Ink and Drink stuff? I don't, as you know, I don't regularly attend meetings, and I know you guys have been doing the online stuff. And recently, have you been getting into? Have you found like a physical location where you guys can meet up?
So sort of. So our actually, this would probably be good to include in the podcast.
I will actually, now in retrospect, it's like this needs to be in the podcast. Yeah. So like,
sure.
Like how are the meetings going?
Sure. So during the pandemic, we've mostly been meeting virtually. Prior to the pandemic, since our favorite place in the world, Cicero's in the U City Loop, closed, we've been meeting at the Schlafly Bottle Works in Maplewood, where they have that nice, beautiful crown room in the back for private parties to meet. Now, because of COVID, that room has been closed. We just did our first in-person meeting last month, and we're just kind of tiptoeing our way back into it. We really wish we could find some place we could meet outside and get a big group going. But it's just kind of coming back together. But yeah, anybody who's interested in joining in an ink and drink should come out to Schlafly Bottle Works. We meet the third Monday of the month. So actually our next meeting is next Monday, June 21st. And anybody who likes comics is involved. You don't have to make comics. You don't have to be interested in making comics even. If you make comics but aren't interested in ink and drink, that's fine too. We're just there to network and meet other people in the scene. It's a really cool opportunity to just meet other people in town who are doing what you're doing.
Oh, right on, man. I'm glad to hear that. Hey, everybody, Aaron Walther here, just reminding you that if you like this podcast, please subscribe to the channel. Also, head over to secondthoughtcomics.com to stay up to date on the various comics that I write. For a limited time, I'm giving away a free PDF of my latest graphic novel, The Amoral Stingray. All you have to do is sign up to the Second Thought Comics newsletter. Link is in the description. Thanks for reading.